So thank you everybody for making time to come out today. A lot of you again, but a lot of you new. How many new? It's been a while. A surprising number of returns for something that we have kind of talked about before. But I definitely think James has some little bit different stuff. The other thing that we'll kind of dip into a little bit, BlueCon, for those of you that have never done it, is like a big deal in the API world. A lot gets covered there. And James was there and was nice enough to kind of put together some recap for us. So we'll dip into that. On events, kind of tail end of the conference season. So you guys all know who've been here before, I suck at events and telling you what's coming up. Keith's way better. But we have name line. No, that's way out.
API Craft.
Oh yeah, API Craft in Detroit coming up at the end of July. I don't have anything else local in town other than Margaret from Rackspace was telling us a little bit about some stuff they're doing with Write the Docs.
Write the Docs. Yeah, we're going to start a meetup in Austin with a colleague of mine, Constance Kutal, and I think it's Craigstall actually. And so if you guys aren't familiar with Write the Docs, it is a group that read the docs. They host Read the Docs, or that's the person who started it. And it's an open source group for writing developer documentation. And more information about when the meetup is will be forthcoming. But if you're interested, see me at the, I don't know if there's a break, but come and talk to me. Yes. And name is Margaret Ecker.
Margaret Ecker. All right.
One other thing, just remember, API Strategy and Practice Conference last fall was in Chicago. They were in London or something. They're going to be here in Austin.
I forgot I'm allowed to talk about it finally.
Yeah, it was finally announced publicly, so we can't. There's no date set yet. Yeah. They're still shopping a venue, but we'll probably have 400 to 500. I think is about what last year's attendance was. So 400 to 500 API lovers here in town talking about everything there is to talk about in the world of APIs.
And plainly spoken, like the existence of this meetup is the only reason they felt comfortable committing to bringing the event here. And frankly, it was one of the big reasons that I wanted to get this thing started so we can bring big API events here and get everybody plugged in. So like, yes, it's awesome. Because if you guys have never been, who's ever been to API Strategy and Practice before? Anyone? Personally, I haven't been to Glue, because every year my schedule gets stepped on, but other than that, which I don't have personal experience with, amazing conference. Freescale puts it on, but it's like the least vendor tainted event I've ever been to. It's excellent. So I'm super looking forward to this fall, and definitely tell your friends. It's already out there publicly. We don't know yet. There's no details.
Austin, right?
Austin. Yes, Austin's so spring is Europe, fall is US for API Strategy. We just got back from Berlin like a month or something ago, and so this fall is Austin. They accidentally I think they accidentally leaked it at the bottom of something.
Oh, so it is.
So I'm allowed to say it. It's official. But we've been working on getting this together for like 6 months. So more details soon. I expect in the next few weeks probably.
What site would you go to check the API strategy doc?
I would, API. Just search for API Strat, and it'll pop right up. And then you can probably subscribe to things there. So anyways, I know we started a little bit late, but there was another great event with good beer and tacos that we were waiting for people to drift over from. So before it gets too late.
Thanks, Jason. So thanks for coming out. Like Jason said, I was at Glue a couple of weeks ago, and I want to talk about that. But first, just a quick blurb about me, just so you know where I'm coming from. So I'm the founder and API architect at LaunchAny, based here in Austin. What I do is API consulting. I work with a lot of startups as interim CTO, kind of de-risk their startup, de-risk the technology side, help them get their product to market, and then hand it off to their full-time CTO. I also do a lot of consulting and training around APIs. So I help cross-functional teams understand what APIs are, how teams can come together and model and design their APIs and so on. So that's a lot why I'm bringing Swagger here. I'm not really affiliated with SmartBear, but some of the SmartBear folks asked that I talk a little bit about what's going on with Swagger since we use it as part of our process. So getting started with Glue, if this will work, and if not, there we go. All right, so we're going to start off with Glue a little bit. Glue is about roughly 500 attendees. They meet in Broomfield, Colorado, on the outskirts of Denver. And like API Strat, it is very much as disconnected from vendors as possible. They have the vendors out there, they have sponsorships. If they have vendors talk at all, it's for little 15-minute blocks, and that's it. And there's very few of them. It's a lot of speakers from a lot of different perspectives. They bring in API, data, Internet of Things, cloud, and now containers and microservices is the big talk this year. So they bring in all of those different integration technologies. A really great conference to attend. And as I mentioned, they do a lot of Internet of Things. There's always a kegerator there. This year was the Internet of Root Beer. SAP had an IoT kegerator that would tweet out every time they poured some root beer. It was really good root beer too. I tried to play buzzword bingo, and I actually spoke about the convergence of APIs, Internet of Things, microservices, and Docker. So I put Docker on a Raspberry Pi. There we go. So I put Docker on a Raspberry Pi, deployed some Ruby microservices, throw some APIs around them, put in Redis, PubSub, did a little 30-minute demo. So that was my part. But there were about 5 core things that came out of GlueCon that I think you'll want to look at. And GlueCon tends to be a place where the presenters are looking anywhere between 12 and 18 months out. The organizer for GlueCon does another one in the fall called DFrag. That's like a 18 to 24 month plus look at technology. So this is what's probably going to be talked about over the next year and beyond, likely where a lot of your technology stacks will be heading. So we'll give you kind of a good preview, and then we'll dive into Swagger. So the first thing that came up was the software architecture evolution, and they kind of laid out a history of where we came from. We did a lot of client server. We then went to 3-tier, where we did client middleware database, right? Then we started doing SOA, started decoupling, but building these monolithic SOA applications that we would deploy out with lots of different web services. SOAP was the term at the time, the technology. And then we started seeing the rise of microservices. And for the first time at Glue, we saw that the industry was driving what people were talking about at Glue. Usually it's the other way around. People in the industry start talking about what the presenters bring about at Glue. So microservices really drove a lot of the presentations. If you're familiar with the Gartner hype cycle, I mean, are you familiar with that, right? We have the technology triggers, the inflated expectations, the trough of disillusionment, the slope of enlightenment, and finally the plateau of productivity. So we go through all of these ups and downs as we figure out new technologies. How do they fit? How are they going to work in our organization? Are they the right thing for us? John Sheehan from RunScope said microservices exist on all points of the hype cycle simultaneously. And somehow managed to hit every one of them at the same time. We're all excited about it. We're all disillusioned about it. We're all still trying to figure it out, and some people are being productive with it. So it's kind of a unique convergence. Adrian Coecraft, he was the architect at Netflix and has contributed a lot to microservices and cloud architecture. Put out a great definition of microservices, and I wanted to share it with you. Loosely coupled, service-oriented architecture with bounded contexts. So we're taking our SOA concepts, we're shrinking them down, we're drawing boxes around them, and then we're going to put many of those into play in the organization and then start to connect them together. That's what he was really trying to define. He also made a statement I think was really powerful. Monolithic apps have invisible internal complexity. So when we build our applications, and when they're monolithic, just meaning probably a singular code base or a singular deployment unit of some sort, they have invisible internal complexity. So that describes why a lot of times our systems are really easy to work with. And then at some inflection point, we start slowing down. It becomes harder and harder to add new features. We have too much fragility in our systems. So his goal is to encourage microservices as part of the architecture to expose that complexity and make it explicit so that we're explicitly defining that complexity and that integration. So that was a way that he was thinking about microservices when he was putting it together. In addition, event-driven architectures are back. I've been using them for a while. I didn't realize they'd gone, but apparently they did, and now they're back again. So they come and go about every 5 years, I think. But there were quite a few talks on event-driven architecture. It's a result of microservices primarily. But there was also that idea of exposing events beyond your system. So we know that we might want to use events inside of our architectures to put things together. And if we have a lot of microservices and we want to expose what's going on internally, we might emit events to let other systems know what's going on and be able to key off that and do things. There was a discussion in one of the API talks about using webhooks to emit those events for customer communication and customer support. So if you're deprecating an API, if you're releasing something new, you could very well offer a webhook and allow your customers to connect into it and be notified and automate off of anything. So rather than, or in addition to sending your emails out as part of your customer support, part of your customer marketing, you could also use webhooks. So using eventing and building that in the architecture and using that for customer support and marketing was a really, really interesting idea that someone had mentioned while we were there. There was also a talk by Donnie Burkholz. He's formerly from Red Monk and now at 451 Research. He was talking about the fragmentation across programming languages and frameworks. If any of you have seen that meme where it's a number of days since a new JavaScript framework has been released and they're replacing it with a 1, and putting 1 day since. We have a lot of different things that are out there. And he talks about how when everyone has to be an expert in everything, it doesn't scale in an organization. So then he spent a lot of time talking about how we think we've reached that point of technology fragmentation and that things will probably start to calm down a little bit. We'll always have choice, and that's a great thing. But when we have so many choices that everyone's expected to have to learn a bunch of different things, it really slows us down. There was discussion on water scrumfall. How many have heard of water scrumfall? Anybody? Yeah. If you haven't heard of it, you probably experienced it. It's the idea that your development team is working in a Scrum-based iterative development methodology, but you basically are doing a waterfall with Scrum in the middle. You do your project planning and your budgeting up front. You have to figure out what it is you're going to do. You promise what it is you're going to do. And then you iteratively work on it, and then you do a big bang release. And so there was a lot of discussion about that, which moved us into the fourth thing, which was managing complexity. Sam Ramsey from Cloud Foundry, of course, he spoke about deployment. He loves his platform as a service. He spent a lot of time talking about that. But part of what he was talking about was solving water scrumfall by allowing the IT groups or the technologists to enable the business to be successful. So we have to find ways to be as efficient as we can on the technology side so that the business would be willing to trust us and engage with us and allow us to move agile outside of the tech world and into the business world. And businesses aren't going to trust us until we can turn things around much quicker. So his theory was, let's manage our complexity. Let's use containers, automation, microservices and other things to manage complexity, define our interfaces clearly, and then build strict boundaries around our systems so that we can manage and deploy things quickly and easily. The final thing that came up at Glue was AWS Lambda. Anybody familiar with Lambda? Mm-hmm. Yeah, anybody using it right now in some way? One, yeah. 1.5 maybe. So yeah, this one is interesting. Caught me a bit off guard in the way that they presented it. Mitchell from HashiCorp was interviewed, and he was talking a little bit about his product line. He's put out Vagrant. He has Atlas, which has Console and a lot of other tools, Terraform and other things in the DevOps world. And he talked about how we're moving from virtualization to containers. And that's kind of happening slowly, but happening right now. And then we're going to start moving from containers to Lambda. And what that really means is we're going to write pieces of code and deploy them, or actually just register the code, and they won't actually be running. They won't be deployed. There won't actually be an instance of them running at any particular time until someone requests that functionality to be called. And we can get the deploys down to milliseconds, where we don't have to sit there and have code sitting on servers doing nothing. Instead, we deploy our code to a particular repository and it gets deployed within milliseconds and then executed. That's where Lambda is going to take us. So starting to think about how would we build software if we were event-driven and if we were building these little pieces of code to respond to particular triggers or pieces of functionality, but they're not actually running right now. They're small enough that they can be deployed, quickly run, and then turned off when they're no longer needed. Really powerful way of doing things. So this was an article in May that was kind of interesting. The feature is now, and it's using AWS Lambda, and kind of spoke a little bit about this. But what it really means is, and they put it in an interesting way, no worrying about starting a new, not even free anymore, Heroku dyno. Right? We don't even have to push our code to dynos for free or nearly free and let them sit there and do nothing for a while. We just register the code and then it gets
cloud, right?
Yeah.
But the thing is, it ties it up, right, to that particular instance.
It does. No, what it's going to do is it's going to generate a model. So AWS Lambda is the first one that's really coming out and doing that. Iron, is it Iron.io, I think, is another one that's somewhat similar. So they'll probably, that model will start to show up with other vendors.
The events are not under your control, right? They're cloud events. And then the code you write is for that cloud. So it's great for Amazon. But.
Yeah, for now. Yeah. All right. So any questions on any of that before we dive into Swagger? Anything else? All right. Everybody's here for Swagger. Let's get on with it. All right. How many here are using Swagger today in some way? All right. Keep your hands up. How many are actually doing 2.0 as opposed to one of the older versions? How many are on 2.0? Okay, so a few of it. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to start, for those of you that aren't familiar with Swagger, we're going to start with a light overview. We're going to talk about what it's about, how it works. We'll talk about the ecosystem, and we'll talk about what's new, okay? So the first thing to understand is that really Swagger is just a representation of your API. It's a way to represent your API. It's primarily used to drive documentation. So we would define our API in a JSON payload following the Swagger format. And then we hand it off to Swagger UI, and Swagger UI reads that and generates a really nice, fancy HTML interface for us. Okay? Now, without Swagger, what we end up doing is having some kind of page like this, and this is an actual API vendor, and they have all these different APIs, and you open up one of them, and you can read the documentation, you can figure out how to run it, which is great. But as a developer, the next thing I have to do is I have to start writing code. I'm either using curl scripts, right, using curl from the command line, I'm writing some little shell scripts, or I'm writing some kind of code to work with the API. Mm-hmm. With Swagger, what I'm doing is defining my API, all my parameters, all my endpoints, all my parameters, the format, the required, not required. I have a nice little HTML interface. I can click it open and look at the particular docs, and then it will take those parameters and put in a form in here for you, tell you what fields are required, what the description is, what the type is, the typical response codes that you might get back from the API, and then a nice little try it out button, which allows me to try out APIs against a live running server. Sometimes it's a sandbox server, sometimes it's production, right here inside our documentation. So I don't even have to write a line of code to try out an API and figure out if it's what I want, right? Really, really powerful stuff.
I have a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
Who has seen this interface but didn't know it was Swagger when they're looking at other APIs? Okay. That seems to be like a recurring theme. I'll show people and they go, oh, that's what Swagger makes, okay.
So, a little bit about Swagger and the structure. I'm not going to go into details. There's plenty of resources that will cover this, and I don't want to occupy a lot of our time. But there is basically an info section where we can describe our API, what it's about. We can even put markup in our description. We can version, title, put in a link to terms of service, provide some contact details, the actual host name, the base path, and the schemes that are supported so that we know where and how to actually get to a live running API. We have paths that define each of the endpoints and the various verbs that they support. So in this example, we have a /pets, and then we have a post and a put. And inside there, we can tag things. We can provide a summary description. We can talk about what kind of content types it accepts on the request, what kind of content types it'll send back on the response. The parameters, this is where we'll have our definition for the different forms in our documentation. So the different types of fields, a description, whether it's required or not. And we can even reference other areas of the documentation. So we can reuse things. We can define structures like a JSON or XML payload structure. We can define it once, and then we can reference it within our docs each time we need to. We can then put in the different response codes that we expect to return. And we even have a security section where we can reference the security definition, which I'll talk about in a second. So this allows us to define each of our endpoints. Now, previously, we'd have to do this in JSON. Now we can do this in YAML, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. We have security definitions here that allow us to define how we're going to protect our API endpoints. It's not super robust, but it's nice enough to tell us at least, am I supposed to be passing in an API key? Is it going in on the header, or is it a parameter? You know, what is it supposed to be? If I'm supporting OAuth 2, it's going to give me the URL of where to send the user for OAuth 2, if there's a user involved, the scopes that are going to be requested, typically, that kind of thing. There's these two types of security requirements. These are from the Swagger spec, API key and then an OAuth that we can reference. So those are the primary two that you'll find within the APIs. And then we have our definitions. These are our objects in some ways. These are where we can reuse a lot of things. We can define something like a user, define all its properties, and use that same kind of format that we had as parameters that we refed earlier from any of the endpoints. So this is where if we're doing a lot of JSON and XML payloads back and forth, we can define it once and then refer to it throughout.
Do you tie it to a schema? JSON schema or XML schema?
I can do that one.
Yeah, go ahead, Jason.
So this definition object, Swagger is based on JSON schema. So oddly, it is both a subset of JSON schema. In other words, there are certain things that aren't really in the Swagger spec, and they add some extra things that JSON schema is kind of missing. If you've worked with JSON schema, it's in draft 04 that expired a year and a half ago. It's had 3 different maintainers over its life. It's a train wreck. So what Swagger has done is try to kind of address what's screwed up about JSON schema. But ultimately, when you get back from kind of the YAML version of this back to JSON, it looks identical to JSON schema for all intent purposes. And you can actually use this object definition, feed it right into a JSON schema validator library against your actual responses, and actually test your response against this schema. Okay. So super powerful tool.
Okay. But is there a mechanism where you, whatever media type you're using, there could be a different kind of schema. Can you refer to an external schema?
So I know that XSD is considered in the Swagger 2 spec, and frankly, I have no idea beyond that because I don't care. Like everything these days is largely JSON. There's the rare exception of XML.
Right, but then you have the JSON schema problem where it's a train wreck. So.
Yeah. I mean, that said, I think what they did in Swagger largely constrains JSON schema stuff that doesn't belong in APIs. They constrain that away. And the stuff that's kind of squirrely missing. So what you define in here largely works very well.
Okay.
But I would also warn that if you use the advanced JSON schema syntax, like some of these sort of inheritance and polymorphism and all this stuff that it does, that's probably the softest area of tool support today. But that and defining like separate JSON schema files that are linked to from your Swagger definition. But I will say every single one of those issues is making progress like in the last 3 weeks. So there's massive progress in library support for all this and tool support right now. Okay.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, Jason and I were having a beer the other day, and he spent a lot of time talking about JSON schema. He spends a lot of time on that side.
Yeah, 150 repos full, but it works. A little bit about it.
So here's just kind of a quick summary of the data types, and I'm not going to, like I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the spec. The spec is actually quite pleasant to read for a specification. It's really easy to read, easy to understand. We have our basic types, just about anything you would commonly need, as well as this password type, just so that it queues in things like Swagger UI or other kind of visualization to say, hey, use the password input field, so we're not, offering up this text clear. So that takes care of most of the data types. But Swagger is much bigger than just the HTML interface, and that's really what we want to talk about today. There's a growing Swagger ecosystem now. We have the Swagger UI, now we have Swagger Editor. How many knew there was a Swagger Editor out now? Oh, good. So the word is getting out. So we have Swagger Editor now, which has started to emerge as a great way to be able to build our Swagger files without having to sit there and write a lot of JSON files. Particularly not approachable for a lot of tech writers or developers that just don't want to sit there and sling a bunch of JSON. And then there are a number of other tools out there as well. They're starting to emerge a lot of code generators because of the Swagger format and the fact that it can define everything there is about your API. We can now get pretty close to writing really comprehensive server frameworks and get all the boilerplate code out of the way, put a lot of things in place that we might want, as well as client libraries to talk to our APIs if we want to generate client libraries in a variety of languages.
Is that Swagger Editor? What is it, like a web app or what?
I'll talk about it. Yeah, it is a web app. Yeah. So there's a growing ecosystem. So what it's allowing us to do now is take that same Swagger definition that would be used in Swagger UI that we would click on and try things out and we would explore API and actually start writing or deriving code from it or deriving our tools from it or deriving our testing from it as well. We can also use Swagger to visualize things. This is a tool called Swaggered, which is a Chrome plugin that allows us to look at a Swagger file and visualize it more like a map, right? Almost like a mind map to allow us to see how things are derived. So it gives us a high-level overview of a particular API before we really ever dig into all of the details. You can understand what models are there, what endpoints are there, what do we have. So this is pretty interesting project that just emerged and is starting to see some traction. Now, Swagger 2.0 was released last year and has been really aimed at evolving the overall syntax. One of the biggest things that they added was support for YAML and for vendor extensions. The vendor extensions are very much like, if you think in the XML world about having namespaced XML, kind of the same sort of concepts. It allows tooling to ignore those extensions and know how to ignore them, but allow for definitions to add new concepts in there without breaking older tools. So it allows us to embellish and extend Swagger, so we can extend it for our own use, other tools can extend it, third parties can extend it, and you can just add those extensions in. So really powerful things in Swagger 2. In addition, we had a bit of a handoff in stewardship of Swagger. So it happened last year, but it was announced early this year that Reverb handed over the stewardship of Swagger to SmartBear. So they're the ones providing the food, the t-shirts, the stickers back there, everything else. All of the nitty-gritty details haven't been announced, but essentially SmartBear has a lot of connections into the enterprise world. They produce SOAP UI, and they have Ready API now, which is a whole suite. So they're in the enterprise space. And what we were seeing with Swagger was really getting a lot of pressure from the enterprise space to beef up, and the Reverb team just really didn't have that experience nor that really desire to jump into the enterprise space, engage in those discussions, and really understand that also. I think it's a really good fit that SmartBear now, with their enterprise connections, can kind of bring all that together. So it helps us as startups, it helps us as product owners, it helps us just as developers to use basic Swagger and what already is there. And then as our teams grow and we need to mature and have more maturity in the tools and the definitions of Swagger and all the infrastructure, SmartBear is going to bring that in.
I would add to that Tony, Tim, and some of the original developers who worked on Swagger are every hour, probably right now, committing emerging code. So it's not like there's any change of the guard of the code being written, like libraries and tools. Those guys are very much involved. But I think there's a little more direction and whatever else that I didn't get James wanted to see there.
So
there's traction.
what are the, what's SmartBear's business case? What are they selling?
They have a number of tools that they sell into the enterprise. So their goal is to try to make sure that they can participate in and support Swagger, so that it matches what their tools need.
Like SOAP UI?
Yeah, like SOAP UI and other things. They're adding Swagger support into it. So they're all in on Swagger. Therefore, they have to have that internal expertise. They have the connection with enterprises. They're hearing enterprises say, we want Swagger support and we want all these other tools, and we're using your suite already.
But are they going to do something like, you have RAML and MuleSoft,
Right.
And I think the idea is you start using RAML, and then whoever set it up quits, and then you say, well, screw it, let's just give it to MuleSoft, and we'll become part of their big offering? Is SmartBear going to have a similar big developer experience, you know,
yeah,
while dancing thing?
Yeah, so they're finding that balance between having staff that are invested in and supporting Swagger, and also maintaining that community connection, allowing the community to drive it so that they're not the only ones driving it. Yeah, so they're trying to balance that out.
Some guys who have done a lot of the Ramble commit stuff, they really don't want it to be that way, but everybody thinks it is.
Yeah, it's just I don't know for a fact. That was my impression just looking at it, and that it was like leading you straight to MuleSoft's. I can't remember what they call their big thing, but.
And that's way more involved with Swagger.
Is that you will have time maybe at the end to contrast for some of those newer that are trying to evaluate just to check?
Between
Ramble, I know there's some differences in the approach.
Yeah.
So maybe
I'll be happy to give some general guidelines and things that I look for just
there's
as
some differences, and even it's a general purpose. Maybe.
Yeah, well, and Jason maybe will speak more than that. I stay out of all of that. I actually look at what's the right fit for the organization and don't get into all those details.
Well, but what's the right, there's a bunch of looking at specific things like what's frustrating about Ramble, what's frustrating about Swagger 2.0. Those are the things you need to know to make the choice for what's the right fit. Like, you know, Swagger 1.0 couldn't deal with XML, right?
Right.
So if you happen to be in a situation where you needed that feature, then Swagger's not a good choice. You know, Ramble isn't really extensible. You know, you can't, you know, that their format, there's no facility for vendor extension. So if there's something that doesn't work and you need to extend it, you're kind of screwed, or you're going to fork any tools of theirs you use. So yeah. Those little details are actually exactly what, and the comparisons, to make the comparison between Ramble and Swagger and Apiary and all the other ones, those are the very details you need to know to make that choice that you're talking about.
I would say on the Swagger stuff, if you have things that you think are missing, this is the time to put issues in GitHub.
Yeah, but unless you're really doing stuff.
Do it now or it's going to get ignored later.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, because the 2.0 spec is just 6 months old, and tool support's getting built up for it. Things are getting nailed down for 2.0, and this is, I feel like, kind of the last good window that if you feel like something's really missing, speak up now, because it'll be 3.0 before you see it. You know, like if it doesn't make the list now, that's my sense.
So on the Swagger community, this is, and it took me a little while to do this, these are all of the different projects that are at least listed on the Swagger website for different projects, different communities that exist out there for Swagger. It's growing heavily, and there's a lot out there that's probably not even captured. A variety of different languages that are supported and other tools. So it is growing heavily. Now, one of the things that they want to do, SmartBear wanted to do, and they're going to drive toward, and I think they've started to release this actually now, is that they're re-releasing the Swagger IO website with support for content being hosted in GitHub. So they have some core pages that aren't going to be hosted in GitHub. And those are the core things that they don't want people changing. Everything else will be available in GitHub. You can fork and issue pull requests to them and allow them to integrate that content in. So what they're trying to do is allow the community to generate, not only update these resources and make sure the links are up to date. If you have a new project or you find something that's interesting, it's not listed there, you can throw it in there. But also they're going to be looking for people to contribute articles, how-tos, other things. So they're looking for the community to help support Swagger, and they're going to use GitHub to do that. Part of the reason that we had the meeting this month is that SmartBear themselves are doing a June release of their own tool set, and all of their tools are going to support the Swagger 2.0. They've had kind of a mixture of support across all their tools, and now they're going to have it all out there. Some of the other things that they've done, the Swagger JS and UI has been upgraded so that it will try to upgrade from an old version of Swagger to 2.0. It will try to make that conversion before it renders. Not everything is going to map over, but it'll get you pretty close so that you can start using the latest Swagger UI and point it at an older version of Swagger. So if you're using 1.2, you can get that to upgrade. They've started rewriting some of the underlying libraries, as well as on the core and CodeGen libraries. They've rewritten them to use Java. They were using Scala. And Scala was a little bit too much for some contributors, right? A lot of developers can probably jump in and pick up Java pretty easily and contribute in some way. Scala, a little bit more of a barrier to entry, so they stripped it back and went down to Java. It also removed the need for the Scala jar, which thinned out the distribution a little bit. They added some extension mechanisms into this code so that you can extend this code a little bit easier. You don't have to fork and start having to work with a lot of, change up private methods and other things like that. There's a little bit more pluggability in these tools. As well as in the CodeGen side, they've been working on some new templates. So there's code generation templates for client libraries and for the server side. On the client side, they've added things like Swift and Perl. They've added a number of others. On the server side, they've released a new version of Jax RS generator for the server side to replace the old one. So they're releasing a lot of new code there. And then on the governance side, so we were talking a lot about, where does SmartBear play? Well, they're trying to build a community-driven governance of the specification. Their goal is by the end of June to figure that out, and they don't know exactly what it's going to look like, so they're still open for input. So if you have input on how you would want to see SmartBear organize a group to oversee the governance of the specification, jump in, help out. If your organization might be interested, talk with them. They're looking at different ways to try to organize the governance so that they can manage it. So Jason's right in the perspective of there's going to probably be some reshuffling on how all this is managed. So get things in now, because as they reshuffle the way that the governance happens, I'm sure there's going to be a bit of a slowdown before they get caught up, because they've got to figure out what this is going to look like. Okay, so be aware of that. Wish lists that I have, at least personally, that I'm still on the lookout for. Managing Swagger across multiple environments, so I can manage my files just by using different folder structures and things like that, but having a way to kind of keep track of them and make them available to external developers as well as internal developers based on a particular environment or something else would be useful. Being able to control the visibility of a particular endpoint. I work with a number of clients that have private API endpoints. They don't want them to be available in the public API documentation. So either they maintain two sets, or they have to do some sort of pre-processing of the Swagger JSON or YAML before it's served up. So having some way to be able to mark those as such a little bit easier, so at least it's a little bit more visible to the developer. Either make them all available and mark them in some way, or be able to filter them out or have some kind of filtering mechanism. Technical writer integration is pretty tough right now. A lot of people are using code tools to generate Swagger from their code,
Right.
or they're generating Swagger separate from their code, but there's no real life cycle there. And I don't know exactly what that would look like. It might be a combination, because technical writers need to be cued on where something has been added or changed in an API. If we added a new parameter or added something else to the payload that wouldn't necessarily impact us on our versioning, but we want to be able to make sure that that's reviewed properly. It may be a combination of tools and maybe a little bit of decorative extensions inside of Swagger. I'm not sure, but this one is a real gap and is really difficult for API writers.
Is there sort of a vision of how this might progress in terms of the use cases? Is it design first and then generate?
Yeah, and we're going to talk about design first,
or is
and
it take from the code and let the developer annotate, and then like the Java stuff? What do you think will be? Or both?
I think it might have to be both. I think we're starting to get toward design
basic
first.
Code gen from the code and then enhancement decoration in API doc. Kind of like a hybrid.
And if you had a way to be able to manage versions and environments, then you might be able to do diffs between them, and it might be able to at least provide some hints, and that may be a way around it too. So I'm not sure.
I think the reality is that content management is so varying and diverse in how people do it, for tech writing especially, that I don't think they can be opinionated in Swagger UI on how to do that. The thing to realize is Swagger UI is basically considered a reference implementation based on the pet store. So if you ever looked at Swagger, they have pet store as their example.
Right.
Swagger UI is essentially a reference implementation. The expectation is you will take that code base, you're going to fork it off and go fiddle with it and integrate it into your own systems, including content management. So I think it's probably a different answer for everybody. Now, like, is there a beautiful, streamlined way to do content management in GitHub? There's about 12.
Yeah, not one of the clients that I work for, do a lot of their training. They have basically created their own developer portal driven off of Swagger, and they have different domains. They're a large organization, so they have different domains, and every domain has any number of different products underneath it that's released through a governance process, and every one of those groups have to produce Swagger. And then it all gets rolled up into a single, it gets rolled into a single portal, and they actually have comments attached to each endpoint where you can do, they use Discuss, I think, or something, and they allow you to do Q&A and stuff.
Where if you, whatever CMS you have, you could have a Swagger plugin and kind of just...
Yeah, and they have their own internal CMS, and they've put hooks in there to link back to that for older archived knowledge, things like that. And then something that I struggle with a little bit, which is each project that I work on, there's always domain concepts that I struggle with to convey. So the APIs that I work with often aren't just a couple of API endpoints. It is generally a platform, and the platform has concepts that have to be explained, perhaps diagrams or other things that need to be realized. And some of that stuff can be embedded inside the description, but trying to figure out how to merge that with other tools and content management systems so that now I can tie all those things together.
Glyphy or something?
I'm sorry?
Like Glyphy or something like that?
Yeah, or Slate is another one I've used, which is kind of a markdown, uses Ruby and Middleman, and it's kind of a markdown driven template. And there's some different ways of doing it so that you can manage the overall getting started documentation in the developer portal and all those different pieces so the developers kind of get up to speed on your documentation. Because if you just throw them a big Swagger UI with all the endpoints, they're not really going to know where to start. So how do you get them started? What are their typical use cases, workflows, and kind of get them software?
If you're kind of coming in to start up and you want to develop that portal, is there already templates out there you can start with? Like, or is it custom CMS type that every company designs their own, or is there already good?
Most people
developer.foo.com.
Yeah, most people will start with the Swagger UI, and then they'll choose some sort of framework that they like, oftentimes a markdown-driven framework, and then they'll just call out to Swagger either in another window or as an iframe or something to embed it in, so that they get all of those other pieces in Swagger. Okay. So there's a lot of life cycle that goes around this that doesn't really exist right now. Now, a lot of where Swagger's headed is that design-first API that we talked about just a little bit ago. So for those that aren't familiar, if we do a design-first approach, what we really want to do is focus on our design of our API and then start developing our definition, and we can use something like Swagger to do that. And then from that, we can start working on our server and our client, so we start working on implementation. So the life cycle looks something like this, where we design our API contract. Right? I do a lot of training to talk about modeling and design. So how do we analyze our problem space? What's the job to be done? And then how do we take those jobs, break them down into API endpoints, break them down into something that allows our developers to get the jobs done, to execute the workflows that need to be done, either from a mobile app, a web interface, or just system-based integration. So we design the API contract. We can then mock up the API to validate our design, to allow us to collaborate with other team members or other departments within the organization, other outside developers to give us feedback on the API before we start implementing. We can start driving our tests for compliance and completeness both. So are we adhering to everything that we said in our implementation, and have we handled everything that we need to handle? Then we can go build our implementation, deploy, and manage. So the idea is to really create a huge feedback loop that we can iterate over, right, constantly. And to be able to do that, and to also parallelize out our development tasks. So if you work in a team of more than just one or two, but even if you just have a team of 2 or 3 developers, one or the whole group can design the API contract and build the definition in Swagger, and then use the supporting Swagger tools to kind of help accelerate that process. QA teams can take Swagger and start building out automated tests and so on, and start pointing it at the mock implementations. So Swagger has always been capable of doing top-down API, design-first APIs, but the tools have really been focused on bottom-up. A lot of the tools were convert my code into Swagger, It was a lot of it, right? And so now, because of that, we're starting to see the need for things like the Swagger editor, and that's what we're going to talk about next. Swagger editor is an application. It's written in Node. You can get to it at editor.swagger.io. It's written in Node and allows us to write YAML on our left-hand editor pane. And then we can see a preview of the documentation on the right-hand side. So we can get this instant feedback to make sure that our Swagger markup is correct, that it reads well. You can get out of the YAML source and look at the actual descriptions and read it for yourself freshly in a preview pane and get that feedback. So we use YAML for the human, and then we can emit JSON for the tools to be able to drive to the other tools. So we can emit that JSON Swagger format to drive it to everything else.
So in the editor, so RAML has a similar thing. This one looks nicer than the RAML version. It's also Node.js. But the annoying thing about it is, it's saving this off to some database, right?
Also a reference implementation that is expected to be wired up to your own storage mechanism.
Okay.
Yep, I'm actually covering that.
Yeah, it's a fair amount of work, to do that.
Would you like to build a thing that connects the whole storage mechanism?
I guess if the editor
would, they're looking for a contributor.
I think once you have if you start with a web-based editor, I guess your alternative is you have to write something that runs on several machines, several different platforms. So it's got to run on Linux and Mac and Windows. So it's probably in Java or something.
Well, that part is solved by Node, right? But the problem is, where do you persist the file that you save?
Yeah.
I want it in GitHub.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's the only thing that, the things that make sense in most cases.
But that's certainly an opinionated reference implementation, especially for enterprises that won't touch GitHub with a 10-foot pole, and they still exist.
Or they have GitHub Enterprise and then you point it at their own internal endpoints, right? Rather than
which is virtually the same, but yeah. At any rate, I've asked those questions. That's kind of the answer. It's like storage is so varied in terms of how you store your specs that it's really hard to do.
Well, and initially you're probably working on a file system, right? You're just starting out. You don't even have a repo.
File system
of the laptop that you're working on. That's what.
It's a Node server that's running.
I know, but you can.
We should talk more after.
Okay.
Please continue, James.
So our basic flow for our Swagger tools, we use our Swagger editor, build up our YAML. We can save it off somewhere, right? Some mythical backend, or save it off to Git via our local Git repo or our local tool set or whatever. And we can then render it, deploy it and render it with Swagger UI or anything else kind of similar. We can also use the code gen capabilities inside the editor. So there are two file pull down menus in here, generate client, generate server. And they actually will call the reference implementations a lot of these common languages that exist. So they've been opinionated and said, these are the generators we're going to offer by default. Oh, man. Just 1 second.
Are you airplaying or plugged in?
Airplane.
Yeah, it does that.
Hey, all right.
Capital factory.
So we can generate a client or generate a server, and it will send this YAML. It will convert it over, send it over to JSON, send it over to one of the generators, and we can generate a client library or server boilerplate, and it'll just give it to us in our browser as a downloadable tarball. The other thing we can do is drive some testing tools. SOAP UI from SmartBear is one. We can import Swagger and it'll start generating some of our automated testing suites. RunScope is another. RunScope will actually monitor your API in runtime. It's a middleware proxy, so it'll sit in between. And you can import Swagger. It'll monitor your API, look at things going across the wire, and alert you if something doesn't look right. So we can use Swagger to drive not just our documentation, but code generation if we want. We can even build our own internal code generators if we want to comply to our own internal standards, tools, libraries, preferences. We can use it to drive testing. When we're looking at the editor and the generators, you can use them either hosted, so we can go to editor.swagger.io and use that. And we can go to generator.swagger.io and you can actually use the generators. And they even offer the generators as an API. So you can actually invoke the generators in a hosted fashion if you don't have to go install all the tooling required. The other thing you can do is you can actually install and customize them yourself. So you can grab Swagger Editor, clone it from GitHub, get all your node dependencies installed, get everything set up, and you're up and running. And for the generator, it's built in Java, so you get to download and install the JVM, Maven, and do all of that whole workflow. Okay, so we have those options as well. On the editor side, as we mentioned before, there's back-end support, so we can reference the back-end endpoint, and we can use get input for retrieving and saving our YAML definitions. So not too terribly painful, but we do have to build something like that if we want to enable that. There are also callbacks inside the editor as well that we can register for to integrate things into our workflow, so our deploy workflows and everything else. So you can see where Swagger started from just driving documentation to now starting to get a little bit more on the full life cycle, right? We're starting to get a little bit further along. Some of the tools that we need are commercial tools right now. Not everything is open source. Some of them are open source and the reference implementations, and we have to kind of make them do what we want. So how do we get started? How do we put all this together? Well, the first thing to do, if you've never used Swagger Editor, try that. There are some samples. You can go to the file menu, pull down menu, and look at some samples. They'll have a pet store and several others. And you can look at that to get familiar with the YAML format for Swagger. I'd recommend in parallel reading the Swagger 2.0 spec. It's really not all that painful. And you can, as you're reading the spec, look at those different samples to see a realized version of each of those different parts of the specification. Most of the samples cover the bulk of the specification. Then once you get a little bit more comfortable with it, you can do a couple things. If you have an API already and you want to start writing Swagger for it, you can start embarking on that path using the editor and starting to build up your YAML. If you don't have an API and you just want to play around with Swagger, go find a third-party API. There are 13,000 plus of them in programmable web and a variety of other ones. Grab something that's small and try something out. Find something that's interesting that doesn't have Swagger already and try writing some Swagger for it.
You want to share it on Mashape?
Yes.
What?
Yeah.
Be nice.
Yeah, share it on Mashape. Yeah. You can then take your Swagger that you've built and tested in the editor and looked at the preview pane, and then go ahead and try pulling down Swagger UI and trying to deploy that one.
And thermal reverse engineer, what do you mean? How do you do that?
Taking documentation, so it's converting someone's HTML-based documentation and start building Swagger definitions for it.
It's a manual process.
Yeah.
You just rewrite it in the Swagger.
Yeah. So if you don't have your own internal API to start with, if you're working on a project that doesn't have APIs yet, or if you're a technical writer or a non-developer, if you're QA or something, you want to just try it out, grab somebody else's API and start from their docs and start building Swagger
once
for
you
that.
have it, then generate the clients and see if the clients can talk to it.
Exactly.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you can also deploy Swagger UI, see it visualized. You could try to hack on Swagger UI a little bit if you want to make it look a little different, style it, whatever you want, and then use the client code generators.
Are there like RAML to Swagger converters, Swagger 2 converters?
There are, yeah. In fact, I think some of the Smart Bear tools are starting to add that in. They're supporting multiple formats. I believe some of the others are doing it. I want to say, is it Apiary or one of the other? There's another tool out there I know that's starting to do that conversion process, and it's not exact, but it'll help get you moved over if you want to jump from one to another for some reason.
Yeah, you lose something because if you use traits and stuff, and if you use fancy stuff in RAML and you do a conversion, then you just flattened all that stuff out, and now it's like, oh, I got to do a lot of work to use whatever the Swagger version of traits is.
Traits and resource types, please provide real examples and create issues in GitHub soon.
Well,
Is that what we're adding more?
we've got all that stuff. We're using all those features in RAML, so I would have to find the time in the next month to really hit Swagger hard to find all the limitations.
So is there,
both of those things don't exist in it.
Oh, they don't exist in Swagger? That makes me sad.
I know. It's the best part of RAML.
Yeah, it is pretty awesome. That was very well done.
Do you have a question?
what was the part? I'm sorry.
Traits.
Traits.
You mentioned something about reusable. I thought that's what
The reference
stuff.
right? Yeah.
In RAML, you can create these. You can create reusable
Snippets.
collections of, like, say, parameters or pieces of a particular method, for example, and you can leave in placeholders, like put in, like, so often it happens that you have a parameter and there's a sentence describing it, and the sentence is the same except for one word for all of your calls. In Roundel, you can have this trait and you can put in this special,
Like a templating.
yeah, templating thing, and then when you invoke it, you say, you say this method is, or this resource is, whatever. You pick up the trait and you can supply those parameters. It's like making a function call. And it ends up being very useful in terms of
not repeating yourself.
Yeah,
and if you change the trait template, it changes across everywhere consistently.
Exactly.
It drives up the spec a lot.
All right, well, that's what I had for this evening. I don't know if we have very much more time for discussion. Are we over our time? I don't remember what time we're supposed to end at.
Okay, we should all be walking out around 9. So
Okay, good. So we have a few minutes. There's some shirts back there from Smart Bear. If you want to grab one, some stickers, they're free. Grab them. There's a little bit more food back there, and we'll be around to chat a little bit more.